Hi, it's Joanne from St. Dunstan's back again. Here we are at chapter 17 of Island of the Blue Dolphins. Storms came early with rain, and between the rains, fierce winds struck the island and filled the air with sand. During this time, I made myself another dress, but most of the days I spent fashioning a spear to catch the giant devilfish. I had seen this spear made, as I had seen my father make bows and arrows, yet I knew little about it, no more than I had about the others. Still, I remembered how it looked and how it was used. From these memories, I made it after many errors and many hours of work, sitting on the floor while Rontu slept nearby and the storms beat upon the roof. 4 of the sea elephant teeth were left, and though I broke all except one, this I worked down to a head with a barbed point. I then made a ring and fastened it to the end of the shaft, and into this ring fitted the head, which was tied to a long string made of braided sinew. When the spear was thrown and struck a devilfish, the head came loose from the shaft. The shaft floated on the water, but the pointed barb was held by the string which was tied to your wrist. This spear was especially good because it could be thrown from a distance. On the first day of spring, I went down to Coral Cove with my new spear. I knew it was spring because that morning at dawn the sky was filled with flocks of darting birds. They were small and black and came only at this time of year. They came out of the south and stayed for 2 suns, hunting food in the ravines, and then flew off in one great flight toward the north. Rontu did not go with me to the beach because I had let him out of the fence and he had not returned. The wild dogs had been to the house many times that winter, and he had paid no heed to them. But the night before, after they had come and gone, he had stood at the fence. He stood and whined and walked up and down. It worried me to see him act so strangely, and when he refused to eat, I finally let him out. Now I pushed the canoe into the water and drifted toward the reef where the devilfish lived. The water was so clear that it was like the air around me. Far down the sea ferns moved as though a breeze were blowing there, and among them swam the devilfish, trailing their long arms. It was good to be on the sea after the winter storms, with the new spear in my hand, but all the morning as I hunted the giant devilfish, I kept thinking of Rontu. I should have been happy, yet thinking of him, I was not. Would he come back, I wondered, or had he gone to live with the wild dogs? Would he again be my enemy? If he were my enemy, I knew that I could never kill him, now that he had been my friend. When the sun was high, I hid the canoe in the cave we had found, for once more it was the time the Aleuts might return, and with the 2 small bass I had speared, though not the giant devilfish, I went up the cliff. I had planned to make a trail from the cave to my house, but had decided that it could be seen from a ship and by anyone standing on the headland. The climb was steep. As I reached the top, I paused for breath. The morning was quiet, except for the noise of the little birds flying from bush to bush and the cries of the gulls who did not like these strangers. Then I heard the sound of dogs fighting. The sound came from far off, perhaps from the ravine, and taking my bow and arrows, I hurried in that direction. I went down the path which led to the spring. There were tracks of the wild dogs around the spring, and among them I saw the large ones of Rontu. The tracks led away through the ravine which winds to the sea. I heard again the distant sound of fighting. I went slowly through the ravine because of my bow and arrows. At last I came to the place where it opens into a meadow right at the edge of a low sea cliff. Sometimes in the summers, a long time ago, my people had lived here. They gathered shellfish on the rocks and ate them here, leaving the shells which after many summers had formed a mound. Over this grass had grown, and a thick-leaved plant called napin. On this mound, among the grasses and the plants, stood Rontu. He stood facing me, with his back to the sea cliff. In front of him, in a half circle, were the wild dogs. At first I thought that the pack had driven him there against the cliff and were getting ready to attack him. But I soon saw that two dogs stood out from the rest of the pack, between it and Rontu, and that their muzzles were wet with blood. One of these dogs was the leader who had taken Rontu's place when he had come to live with me. The other one was Spotted, I had never seen. The battle was between Rontu and these two dogs. The rest were there to fall upon whichever was beaten. So great was the noise made by the pack, they had not heard me as I came through the brush, nor did they see me now as I stood at the edge of the meadow. They sat on their haunches and barked, with their eyes fixed on the others. But I was sure that Rontu knew I was somewhere near, for he raised his head and smelled the air. The two dogs were trotting back and forth along the foot of the mound watching Rontu. The fight had probably started at the spring, and they had stalked him to this place where he had chosen to fight. The sea cliff was behind him, and they could not reach him from that direction, so they were trying to think of some other way. It would have been easier if one could have attacked him from the back and one from the front. Rontu did not move from where he stood on top of the mound. Now and again he lowered his head to lick a wound on his leg, but whenever he did, he always kept his eyes on the two dogs trotting up and down. I could have shot them, for they were within reach of my bow, or driven off the pack, yet I stood in the brush and watched. This was a battle between them and Rontu. If I stopped it, they would surely fight again, perhaps at some other place less favorable to him. Rontu again licked his wounds, and this time he did not watch the two dogs moving slowly past the mound. I thought it was a lure, and so it proved to be, for suddenly they ran toward him. They came from opposite sides of the mound, ears laid back and teeth bared. Rontu did not wait for the attack, but leaping at the nearer one, turned his shoulder and with his head lowered caught the dog's foreleg. The pack was quiet. In the silence I could hear the sound of the bone breaking, and the dog backed away on 3 legs. The spotted dog had reached the top of the mound. Whirling away from the one he had crippled, Rontu faced him, but not in time to fend off the first heavy rush. Teeth slashed at his throat, and as he turned his body, struck him instead on the flank, and he went down. At that moment, while he lay there on the grass with the dogs circling warily and the pack moving slowly toward him, without knowing that I did so, I fitted an arrow to the bow. A good distance separated Rontu from his attacker, and I could end the battle before he was wounded further or the pack fell upon him. Yet, as before, I did not send the arrow. The spotted dog paused and turned in his tracks and again leaped, this time from behind. Rontu was still lying in the grass with his paws under him, and I thought he did not see that the other was upon him. But crouching there, he suddenly raised himself and at the same time fastened his teeth in the dog's throat. Together they rolled off the mound, yet Rontu did not let go. The pack sat restless in the grass. In a short time Rontu rose to his feet and left the spotted dog where it lay. He walked to the top of the mound and lifted his head and gave a long howl. I had never heard this sound before. It was the sound of many things that I did not understand. He trotted past me and up the ravine. When I got to the house, he was waiting. He was there waiting, as if he had not been away or nothing had happened. In all the time he lived, Rontu never left again, and the wild dogs, which for some reason divided into two packs, after that never returned to the headland. Chapter 18. Flowers were plentiful that spring because of the winter's heavy rains. The dunes were covered with mats of sandflowers, which are red and have tiny eyes that are sometimes pink and sometimes white. Yuccas grew tall among the rocks of the ravine. Their heads were clustered with curly globes no larger than pebbles and the color of the sun when it rises. Lupins grew where the springs ran. From the sunny cliffs, in crevices where no one would think anything could grow, sprang the little red and yellow fountains of the comel bush. Birds were plentiful too. There were many hummers which can stand still in the air and look like bits of polished stone and have long tongues to sip honey with. There were blue jays, which are very quarrelsome birds, and black and white peckers that pecked holes in the yucca stalks and the poles of my roof, even in the whalebones of the fence. Red-winged blackbirds also came flying out of the south, and flocks of crows, and a bird with a yellow body and a scarlet head, which I had never seen before. A pair of these birds made a nest in a stunted tree near my house. It was made from strings of the yucca bush and had a small opening at the top and hung down like a pouch. The mother laid 2 speckled eggs, with which she and her mate took turns sitting on. After the eggs hatched, I put shreds of abalone under the tree, and these she fed her young. The young birds were not like their mother and father, being gray and very ugly, but anyway I took them from the nest and put them in a small cage that I made of reeds. So later in the spring, when all the birds except the crows left the island and flew to the north, I had these 2 for friends. They soon grew beautiful feathers like those of their parents and began to make the same sound, which was reap, reap. But it was soft and clear and much sweeter than the cries of the gulls or the crows or the talk of the pelicans, which sounds like the quarreling of toothless old men. Before summer came, the cage was too small for my 2 birds, but instead of building a larger one, I cut the tips of their wings, 1 wing of each, so they could not fly away, and then let them loose in the house. By the time their wings had grown out, they had learned to take food from my hand. They would jump down from the roof and perch on my arm and beg, making their reap reap sound. When their wings began to feather out, I cut them again. This time I let them loose in the yard, where they hopped around hunting food, perching on Rontu, who by now had gotten used to them. The next time they feathered out, I did not trim their wings, but they never flew farther away than the ravine and would always come back at night to sleep, and no matter how much they had eaten, to ask for food. One, because he was larger, I called Tanor. I named him after a young man I liked who had been killed by the Aleuts. The other was called Luray, which was a name I wish I had been called instead of Karana. During the time that I was taming the birds, I made another skirt. This one I also made of yucca fibers, softened in water and braided into twine. I made it just like the others, with folds running lengthwise. It was open on both sides and hung to my knees. The belt I made of sealskin, which could be tied in a knot. I also made a pair of sandals from sealskin for walking over the dunes when the sun was hot, or just to be dressed up when I wore my new skirt of yucca twine. Often I would put on the skirt and the sandals and walk along the cliff with Bantu. Sometimes I made a wreath of flowers and fastened it in my hair. After the Aleuts had killed our men at Coral Cove, all the women of our tribe had singed their hair short as a sign of mourning. I had singed mine also, with a faggot, but now it had grown long again and came to my waist. I parted it and let it fall down my back, except when I wore a wreath. Then I made braids and fastened them with long whalebone pins. I also made a wreath for Rontu's neck, which he did not like. Together we would walk along the cliff looking at the sea, and though the white men's ship did not return that spring, it was a happy time. The air smelled of flowers, and birds sang everywhere. Chapter 19. Another summer had come, and still I had not speared the giant devilfish that lived near the cave. Every day during the spring, Rontu and I went to look for him. I would put the canoe in the water and paddle slowly through the cave, from one opening to the other, often several times. I saw many devilfish there where the black water is streaked with light, but not the giant one. At last I gave up looking for him and began to gather abalone for winter. The red shells hold the sweetest meat and are best for drying, though the green ones and the black are also good. Because the red ones are the sweetest, starfish prey upon them. This star-shaped creature places itself over the shell of an abalone. With its 5 arms spread out against the rock to which the abalone is fashioned, it holds the shell with its suckers, and then begins to lift itself. The starfish pulls against the abalone shell, sometimes for days, holding on with its suckers and pushing up with its legs, until little by little the heavy shell comes loose from the body. One morning we left the cave and paddled out to the reef which is joined to it. For many days I had been gathering a few shellfish on the rocks at Coral Cove, but I had been watching the reef and waiting for the right time to harvest. This is when there are few starfish feeding, for they are as hard to pry loose from an abalone as an abalone is to pry from a rock. The tide was low, and the reef rose far out of the water. Along its sides were great numbers of red abalone and very few starfish, so before the sun was high I filled the bottom of the canoe. The day was windless, and since I had all I could carry, I tied the canoe, and with Rontu following me, climbed onto the reef to look for fish to spear for our supper. Blue dolphins were leaping beyond the kelp beds. In the kelp, otter were playing at the games they never tire of, and around me everywhere the gulls were fishing for scallops, which were numerous that summer. They grow on the floating kelp leaves, and there were so many of them that much of the kelp near the reef had been dragged to the bottom. Still there were scallops that the gulls could reach, and taking them in their beaks, they would fly far above the reef and let them drop. The gulls would then swoop down to the rocks and pick the meat from the broken shells. Scallops fell on the reef like rain, which amused me, but not Rontu, who could not understand what the gulls were doing. Dodging this way and that, I went to the end of the reef where the biggest fish lived. With a sinew line and a hook made of abalone shell, I caught 2 that had large heads and long teeth but are good to eat. I gave one to Rontu, and on the way back to the canoe gathered purple sea urchins to use for dyeing. Rontu, who was trotting along in front of me, suddenly dropped his fish and stood down looking over the edge of the reef. There, swimming in the clear water, was a devilfish. It was the same one I had been hunting. It was the giant. Seldom did you see any devilfish here, for they like deep places, and the water along this part of the reef is shallow. Perhaps this one lived in the cave and came here only when he could not find food. Rontu made no sound. I fixed the head of the spear and the long string that held it to my wrist. I then crawled back to the edge of the reef. The giant had not moved. He was floating just below the surface of the water, and I could plainly see his eyes. They were the size of small stones and stood out from his head, with black rims and gold centers, and in the centers a black spot, like the eyes of a spirit I had once seen on a night that rain fell and lightning forked in the sky. Where my hands rested was a deep crevice, and in it a fish was hiding. The giant was half the length of my spear from the reef, but while I watched, one of his long arms ran out like a snake and felt its way into the crevice. It went past the fish and along the side of the rock, and then the end of it curled back. As the arm gently wound itself around the fish from behind, I rose to one knee and drove the spear. I aimed at the giant's head, but though it was larger than my two fishes and a good target, I missed. The spear struck down through the water and slanted off. Instantly, a black cloud surrounded the devilfish. The only thing I could see of him was one long arm still grasping his prey. I jumped to my feet to pull in the spear, thinking I might have a chance to throw it again. As I did so, the shaft bobbed back to the surface, and I saw that the barbed point had come loose. At the same moment the string tightened. My grip on it broke, and aware that I had struck the devilfish, I quickly dropped the coils it held, for when the string runs out fast it burns your hands or becomes entangled. The devilfish does not swim with fins or flippers like other things in the sea. He takes water in through the hole in the front of his body and pushes the water out behind through two slits. When he is swimming slowly, you can see these two streams trailing out, but only then. When he moves fast, you can see nothing except a streak in the water. The coils I had dropped on the rock hopped and sang as they ran. Then there were no more of them. The string tightened on my wrist, and to loosen the shock, I leaped across the crevice in the direction the giant had taken. With the string in both hands, but still fastened to my wrist, I braced my feet on the slippery rock and leaned backwards. The string snapped tight with the weight of the devilfish. It began to stretch, and fearing that it might break, I walked forward, yet I made him pull me every step. He was moving toward the cave, along the edge of the reef. The cave was a good distance away. If he got there, I would surely lose him. The canoe was tied just in front of me. Once I was in it, I could let him pull me until he grew tired. But there was no way to untie the canoe and still hold on to the string. Rontu, all this time, was running up and down the reef, barking and leaping at me, which made my task harder. Step by step, I walked forward until the devilfish was in the deep water close to the cave. He was so close that I had to stop even if the sinew broke and I lost him. I therefore braced myself and did not move. The sinew stretched, throwing off drops of water. I could hear it stretch, and I was sure it would break. I did not feel it cutting into my hands, though they bled. The pull suddenly lessened, and I was sure that he was gone. But the next instant I saw the string cutting the water in a wide circle. He was swimming off from the cave and the reef towards some rocks that were about twice the length of the string away. He would be safe there too, for among them were many places to hide. I pulled in half the string while he was moving toward the rocks, but soon had to let it out. It grew tight and again began to stretch. The water here was only a little over my waist, and I let myself down over the reef. There was a sandbar not far from the rocks, and stepping carefully on the bottom, which was full of holes, I slowly made my way toward it. Rontu swam along by my side. I reached the sandbar before the devilfish could hide himself in the rocks. The string held, and he turned about and once more swam toward the cave. Twice again he did this. Each time I took in some of the string. Excuse me. The third time, as he came up into the shallow water, I walked backward across the sandbar so he would not see me and pulled on the string with all my strength. The giant slid up on the sand. He lay with his arms spread out, partly in the water, and I thought he was dead. Then I saw his eyes moving. Before I could shout a warning, Rontu rushed forward and seized him, but the devilfish was too heavy to lift or shake. As Rontu's jaws sought another hold, 3 of the many arms wound themselves around his neck. Excuse me. Devilfish are only dangerous when in the water, where they can fasten themselves to you with their long arms. These arms have rows of suckers underneath them, and they can drag you under and hold you there until you drown. But even on land, the devilfish can injure you, for he is strong and does not die quickly. The giant was flailing his arms, struggling to get back into the water. Little by little, he was dragging Rontu with him. I could no longer use the string because it was wound around Rontu's legs. The whalebone knife I used for prying abalone from the rock was tied to a thong at my waist. The blade was thick at the point, but had a sharp edge. I dropped the coils of string and unfastened the knife as I ran. I ran past the devilfish and got between him and the deep water. So many of his arms were flailing that it was useless to cut any of them. One struck me on the leg and burned like a whip. Another, which Rontu had chewed off, lay wriggling at the edge of the water as if it were looking for something to fasten onto. The head rose out of the twisting arms like a giant stalk. The gold eyes, with their black rims, were fixed on me. Above the sounds of the waves and the water splashing and Rontu's barking, I could hear the snapping of his beak, which was sharper than the knife I held in my hand. I drove the knife down into his body, and as I did this, I was suddenly covered, or so it seemed, with a countless number of leeches sucking at my skin. Fortunately, one hand was free, the hand that held the knife, and again I struck down through the tough hide. The suckers, which were fastened to me and pained greatly, loosened their hold. Slowly the arms stopped moving and then grew limp. I tried to drag the devilfish out of the water, but my strength was gone. I did not even go back to the reef for my canoe, though I did take the shaft and the head of the spear, which had cost me much labor, and the sinew line. It was night before Rontu and I got back to the house. Rontu had a gash on his nose from the giant's beak, and I had many cuts and bruises. I saw 2 more giant devilfish along the reef that summer, but I did not try to spear them. That was the end of chapter 19. I'll be back in a bit.